Hey Daryl,
Hello, Scott.
how are you?
I'm all right.
That's good.
How things on your end?
It's good, you know. I'm still sort of locked down here in the bunker of my home. Chicago still is dealing with the COVID-19 outbreak, and but you know, not so bad. Getting work done, meeting friends like you online, and hopefully getting ready for when things begin to open up. I can see that people are beginning to join us for this second webinar for the insiders group of people who pre-ordered the book. We'll just give them a few moments to log in and get ready for this next hour of conversation about the Better Results book.
Yeah, and it's interesting times that we're speaking in as well, because at your end of the world in US, it's kind of different than my end of the world in Western Australia, because there's a lot of more opening up now. And like over the weekend, I had to meet somebody in emergency for a clinical case, and we went by the park, and oh my goodness, everybody is in the park.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And it's you're going into winter, or you're into winter right now?
Yeah, we're going into winter. We're still in an autumn. I'm never good with this sort of dates, but yeah.
Hmm.
As we speak as well, we've got more people coming in. So hello to Allison, Frank, Joshua, Manon, Osamin. Good to have you, Peter, as well. Good to have you guys here again. Do you want to say a little bit about what we're going to talk about today for this special insiders group before even the book's launch, Scott?
Yeah, today we're going to do a couple of things. First off, we're really interested in hearing, since you have now received, I think, 5 chapters of the book. If you have thoughts and feedback about what you've read so far, no pressure if you haven't done that. The second thing is we're going to talk about the need for a baseline, because this is a real critical piece of the deliberate practice process, and something that I think both Daryl and I fear is left out of the conversation when the topic of deliberate practice is talked about, and it is increasingly talked about in research and training circles. So we'll talk about both of those things, Daryl. I think we
That's
should
right.
go ahead and get started here.
Let's do that. Let's do that. I think as we talk about baseline as well, one of the things that doesn't get talked a lot about in terms of our own development as individual practitioners is also spending enough time to figure out the what before jumping to the how, and that's an area that I think people see deliberate practice as something to just jump right in and do the practice, so to speak. But I think it needs some discernment prior to that. There's so much of the pre-work that needs to be set up after the baseline's been there.
Well, it's certainly, we are a practical lot, and we're hungry for people to tell us how to do it. That's the way I have been since I was a young therapist. My experience coming up in the field was I got lots of theory, and some therapists seemed very able to apply those theories and ideas to their work, but I was lost. I needed somebody to say, first you say A, then you say B, and if they say C, you say D. So it's not a big surprise to me that people then make the same logical leap when the subject of deliberate practice comes up, and they simply say, just tell us how to do deliberate practice. And believe me, already there are new videos and new material coming online that are very willing to tell you, here's how you deliberately practice. It's appearing in the title of books and articles and a whole host of things. I
So
agree with you, it
let,
jumps the gun.
let, let's talk about that for a little bit, right? I mean, like, doesn't this appeal to what we call the need of therapists, that they want that kind of directionality, so therefore they ask these sort of questions rightfully?
Well, you know, like I do, that professional development and the feeling that I'm getting better or that I'm developing professionally is a key to not burning out in the field. this is the work really of David Orlinsky and Mikael Runnestad, that fundamental sense that I am expanding my knowledge and my skills really serves as a bulwark against the feeling of burnout and leaving the field. So I do think uh, therapists are disposed, and it's probably motivated by heart. They really do want. There's always a bad apple in the bunch, but for the most part, I'm inspired when I go teach. In fact, right now during the COVID-19 outbreak,
Mm.
it's the thing I miss most are those interactions with therapists and that hunger that they have to improve.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what I guess you get that a lot at your workshops when you get to meet them on one-on-one level as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and just their willingness to try new things. Again, like I say, there's always somebody who is not interested in that, but I would, at least my experience the last 35 years on the road, traveling around the world,
Mm.
workshops full of people, they want practical advice for what they can do to better help their clients. And I know that you've found in the online workshops that and trainings that you're delivering this in a very different way.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, we've been delivering in instead of giving people one whole intensive bunch of information, we've been delivering it more by drip based, so one key idea at a time, so that people can let that enter into their system, metabolize that, but also let it weave in with their daily lives to see how that interacts and translate in a very practical way, as you said. And I think, that speaks of a different way of what it means to be learning deeply and different from how we have been couched into learning in a traditional sense in our formal pedagogy. But Scott, I think just before I think you and I might have also jumped a little bit of the gun. One question you did raise was about people's feedback about if they have read the book.
Yeah.
Please chime in into the chat that you would see in this platform on Zoom. And also, if you were here for the first webinar, if there were comments or questions that came from there as well, feel free to chime in, and Scott or myself will keep an eye on that as we come in. Or do we want them to also, if they want to speak, would they? Is that an option for them, Scott?
Sure, I think it's absolutely an option. So if they would like to participate and ask their question live, I think they can
Mm.
just raise their hand or type it in the chat box, and I can try to unmute them from my end here, and we can hear them speak live about their experience of the first 5 chapters of the book or any questions that are left over from last time. And I'm monitoring that right now, Daryl, so I'm not seeing anything yet.
That's okay. So you guys take your time while Scott and I will just banter back and forth to wait for some questions to come in. As you know, the publisher, American Psych Association, has agreed to allow the book to come out to you guys, a special exclusive insiders group where you get the chapters, and you are actually the first few people who have seen the book. So we're waiting for the next few chapters to come out, where we would send it to you on a weekly basis. And as planned, the book is going to be out on May 26th.
It's a bit of a nail biter, I have to say, because so far the only people who've read this thing are me, you, Mark Hubble, and our very thorough and gracious editors at the American
That's
Psychological
great.
Association. I have to say that working with them has been a really incredible experience. It's peer review par excellence, I would say. Even just last week, I know that you know this, Daryl, I got an email from the editor saying, there was a quote in the book that I'm not sure is quite right. And, lo and behold, we go and check it. And I don't know how this errant quote made it through the review process, because me and Mark have done this. We sent it out to 3 external reviewers. They've had internal editors work with this. So it really does show the power of feedback and just vigilance at a task, having lots of people, including those who are dispassionate about the material, take a look at what's being written.
Absolutely. And hopefully we too get the audiobook that we're trying to work on this to come out, and that's gonna unfortunately not be before May 26th, but we
Yeah.
certainly would work on that.
And I'm seeing a comment here from Osama Salim, who says he's just finished the chapters, all the ones out to date. Thank you very much for that. And he says, I really liked the brevity and succinctness. Also, the exercise at the end of the chapter 3, where you describe how you typically conduct a session, I thought was challenging and very giving. Thanks for that.
Wow. Wow, thanks for that, Osama. You know, it's funny that Osama, I think you're from Sweden, and we communicated before that you brought this up because Scott, you and I last week were talking about this, about how challenging it is that we see discussing with people in the agencies or individual coaching, that developing a baseline blueprint of how you do your work is daunting. It's like, where do you even scratch your head to begin to think about that, right?
And the issue, I think the problem really is that at one time, all of our moves in the session were conscious moves. If I remember back to some of my very first clients, I was painfully conscious of every move, how I placed my hands, whether I had eye contact, every single word I thought of before I said it, and then I tortured myself afterwards, reflecting on it, really trying to flesh out, what did it mean when I said I was doing therapy? So this first critical piece, in addition to gathering outcome data and alliance data, which are also critical aspects of doing your establishing your baseline, is to create that blueprint for how you do therapy. And believe me, that's going to take some thought because much, as we say, becomes automatic in time. And we discuss automaticity at length in the volume
Yeah.
as both a good thing and a bad thing.
That's right. And it's funny you say you were painfully conscious when you first started practice. For me, Scott, I was painfully unconscious. I was just going with the flow, just kind of feeling my way through. And when you don't know anything, you just go, mm-hmm. And then, just playing with the vibe of things, And then when people ask you how you do what you do, and you go, yeah, I just respond and react to the moment. And I think that's also probably both good and bad, because the good side is you're really trying to be responsive and attuned, but the downside is when you think about how to scale that, how to go beyond what you said, Scott, about the automaticity to counteract that, you have no reference. You have no way to refer to what was your prior blueprint to update, to reiterate, or to refine, refinement is one of the pillars that we argue for in deliberate practice. So I think, especially for people who first are new in the field, I would say go slow, because, we're all scrambling to get something to have a handle. We need some kind of structure. Now, and also, we've been talking about this, that models offer a form of structure for us to think. Therapy models do that. But I think we need to think beyond the models and just think about structure of the therapy hour as well, right? How you begin, how you take things further, how you set a sense of consensual focus, how you deepen the emotional experience, how do you create an impact, how do you lead to a different stage when they end, how do you wrap things up, and so on. I think these things will start to become clearer as you practice, but it's always good. And I think like what you said, Scott, I think to find a way to put it down, to maybe just do what we call a blank page approach. Just take a blank page, put a circle in the middle, and start to branch out how you conduct the session. Or if you prefer, even a timeline where you go, okay, beginning, this is normally what I say, and then this is what I do, and just kind of spell it out. And as you do that within the constraint of a single page, it really helps the monkey mind from going, there's so much things to put on. If you put that constraint, maybe even set a clock of a constraint, it probably helps to just get the first bite, to put it down. And then, keep doing that. But I think something that you said, Scott, we need to underscore. Doing that alone is inadequate. It still needs to be wrapped around with some kind of consistent routine measurement to make sure that what you intuit is also fitting with the what the clients is saying via the measures.
Wow, everything is so rich what you've said here, Daryl. To me, it's rich and there's a lot in there. So I want to just unpack some of that stuff. The first thing, let's the first thing for me is the last thing you said, which is start gathering outcome and alliance data and do that automatically. It's sort of like the odometer on your vehicle. Just allow that data to collect, set it aside, don't think about it, just start doing it. Then the second thing, if you go a little bit further back, is you mentioned two ways to begin to plot your blueprint. And again, this is really essential. I'm glad that Osama mentions it because I think it's easy in the book to focus more on the empirical or quantitative side than the blueprint side. And you mentioned two ways to do that. One way is sort of a more linear, time-oriented way, which is I first say this, I second say that, I third say this, and then whatever branches there are. If the client says A, then I say B. And a second way, which might be, I don't know, you share your opinion with me, Daryl, easier in the beginning is to sort of mind map this old idea of mind mapping your
That's
clinical
right.
process. And maybe you can do it on a single piece of paper. This is essentially how we wrote the deliberate practice book. We had pieces of paper with the
On a
central
single
node
piece of paper.
in the middle, right? And that central node was we wanted to talk about how therapists could get better results. But then there were all sorts of ideas that branched off of that, and each one of those had a node with more branches. It can quickly become overwhelming and see disorganized, but if you stand back from it after a while, noticing throughout a week when you say a certain thing and then going back to that mind map and asking yourself, well, where does that fit in? Why did I say that in that particular way? It fleshes out and you start to get a gestalt of the way you work rather, and I'm not suggesting it's a worse way to do it, just a linear progression, which can be pretty hard to lay out before you do a mind mapping approach, or at least that's the way I found it.
Totally agree. I think most people, when they first start doing this, giving the provision to just plonk it out is probably the best, which is non-linear. And for people who want to take it further, or for some people who like to think very sequentially, then maybe that sort of timeline way might help. But either way, is to put it down first. And I think the constraint, I remember somebody, an author by the name of Stephen Pressfield, he said that when he is writing a book, when he's trying to tell the story in a fiction book, he does this thing called the full step method, I think he calls it, which is he wants all the gist of the characters, the plot, the twists, all to be explained in one piece. Because then, like you said, it gives that gestalt, it gives that holistic picture of where it is, and somehow that kind of constraint is really limiting, but at the same time liberating, because all you always need is to make sure that you have that reference point. Because without that reference point, it's hard to know where you're going if you don't know where you came from.
And that's something that, let me just add to, explains for me a lot about why so far we have very little evidence that therapists, despite their addition of new techniques and ideas to their toolkit, don't improve over time. Some do, there are exceptions, but on average, our outcomes, if you remember the Goldberg study from 2016, they don't go up, they go down. And therapists spend literally millions of dollars and thousands of hours over the course of their career in these mandated continuing education. And it's tragic. And people then have asked me, for example, well, are you against continuing education? And am I against it? I would like that it worked. But if we have no idea of our map, then these ideas simply become absorbed in the Borg of our way of working. They don't stand out. So that blueprint helps us make graduated changes so that we can evaluate the impact actually on our performance. I know, Daryl, that you're a musician, for example, and this to me is similar to practicing scales. Scales aren't music, but they do establish a pattern of behavior vis-a-vis the piano, that when we make subtle changes in the way we strike the key, how we hold our fingers, the timing, we notice those changes and we can evaluate whether they're an improvement or not.
Right, right. And I think that the point about maps as well, everybody's selling a map these days.
Hmm.
And what we are really arguing for is we're trying to give you, if you like, a meta map that you can create your own map, because this is so fundamentally different. We are saying that we need to think about this not on an average level. We have to think about this on an idiomatic individual level, where each of you take the effort to figure out where you are, develop some kind of baseline about your effectiveness, and a rough map of how you do your stuff, how you do Scott Miller therapy, how you do Summit therapy, how you do Allison's type of therapy. These are uniquely your voice.
Hmm.
We don't need another cockwheel type of therapist. We need you. We need people to be able to bring the personhood into their professional role, and that starts with some kind of reference. And I think that's going to be quite key
Hmm.
for the using deliberate practice in their development.
Absolutely. And to me, I suppose what we've tried to do is capture and then show what happens anyway.
Hmm.
Therapists, and I think this is the brilliance of psychotherapy as compared to, say, perhaps medicine, are raised in a particular culture and context that are meeting specific kinds of people in their work. They take the ideas they learn in workshops and they make them their own. They tailor them, hopefully, to
Right.
fit the way they speak, rather than becoming parrots of whatever particular approach that there is. And I know this tension exists between, on the one hand, individualization, and on the other, protocols. Uh, I think what we're saying is we're trying to tap and exploit that individual difference between therapists and make it your own.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's so critical. And to take things to make it even harder than it already is, you use the music analogy, and it's easy to practice getting good at an instrument because the reference is pretty clear, right? That if you play faster, better, clearer, that's that defined target of learning is pretty clear. But to get better at becoming a songwriter, for example, or somebody who performs, that's even wider and harder to pinpoint, less of a clear target.
Hmm.
And I think this speaks to Robin Hogarth's point about kind versus wicked environment, because a kind environment is sort of like golf, where, you know, that's where you need to aim the ball. That's what you need to keep working on. Very clear. Keep doing that, putting or whatever. I'm not a golfer, but you do that, right? It's pretty obvious.
Hmm.
But then, chess, by the way, is also defined as a very kind environment, though it gets really complicated. There's lots of different things that you can learn from, and all kinds of names people give to different kinds of moves.
Hmm.
But it's still a kind environment because the goal is very clear.
And the
But then,
rules.
and the rules are very clear. And guess where psychotherapy situates in that spectrum of kind versus wicked? We would argue that it's definitely not in the kind environment, because you have different people with different wants, and when they say they're depressed, they mean different things from the same people who may have the same diagnosis they were given. And, so much nuance, contextual and idiosyncrasy involved. And then adding to the mix of the therapy is therapists as well. So, which means that fundamentally, to figure out what to work on after you develop the baseline is also another piece of the puzzle that needs time to be able to address. You and I were talking about it recently, Scott, about how people were asking about, so what exactly is the task of deliberate practice, right? Like, what do I have to do? You want to say a bit about this? about then, you know, how then people need to start to take the time to identify their edge.
Yeah, sure. So here we've been talking about a blueprint and creating a blueprint, and the whole point of this is to make us conscious again. And there's an interesting comment by Allison here that's, I think, speaks specifically to this, Daryl. She says, I know that in addition to my aggregate data, my coaching work with Scott, which is still in its very early stages, but which has led me to tracking over time what has seemed to go well and go not so well, baseline work. And she says that in and of itself has upped her game. I think I
Mm.
feel much more aware of process issues, and that seems beneficial. So there
Yeah.
is sort of this double-edged sword, and I'm going to circle back around to your point here in a second, Daryl. There is this double-edged sword of automaticity. You need to develop automaticity. It's one of the wonders of human behavior, because it makes our work efficient. We don't have to decide how to move our legs to get out of bed each morning, or will every act as I pick up this cup of coffee. It's all automatically, it's done without thinking. At one time, however, we did have to think about all of those things. For most of us, we can't even remember when that was, but if you have a toddler at home, a child that's just getting on their feet, you can see them willing, consciously, their effort aimed at achieving very, very small things that for the rest of us have gone by the wayside. So it helps us become efficient. The other side of the sword is it's also when we stop learning. So by
Mm.
specifying this map, we do make it conscious. We become aware, as in meditation, of our breathing, so to speak. And that puts us back in control of our behavior. And that's the critical piece that needs to happen for learning. And both the blueprint can do that, and
Mm.
the gathering of aggregate data can begin to make us conscious. And then in order to figure out what to work on, we need to take the sort of next step. And that next step means finding when our behaviors, the things that we do in the room, fall short, when they don't achieve the outcomes that we're hoping for, either in terms of engagement of the client, we lose engagement, or in terms of progress from session to session. Both of those things can give us a clue about where our edge might be. And the more data I gather, the better and more fine discriminations I can make. I might initially simply be able to divide my clients and my shortcomings by such gross differences as gender identity, male
Mm.
versus female versus trans, all of these. And over time, I might be able to see that between my second and third visit, or within my second visit, I start to lose engagement simply by watching the data as we go along. So that's for me about how we're going to have to circle around to the how. And I guess as even I say it, Daryl, it can feel overwhelming. Uh, so let me just mention one more thing, and then I'll turn it back to you. When you first start gathering data, there are two kinds of errors that we can look at in both our aggregate data and our blueprint. We're going to call them, and we do call them in the book, non-random and random errors. And the reason we call them that is a non-random error means it was not something fundamental to the way we work that caused the problem, but rather the wicked environment in which we work. And to take it one step further, the most wicked part of the environment in which most of us work is the client who walks in the door. Not that they're wicked, but rather they bring with them the single largest source of variability in the outcomes. For most of us, we can't control who walks through the door. I'll mention one other thing. My friend,
Mm.
Don Meichenbaum, who's, I think he was voted one of the top 10 most influential psychologists in history. He's a really interesting guy, a kind of an outlandish guy. And he talks like this. He has a loud voice. He screams when he teaches. And Don says, there's only one way to improve as a therapist. And I said, Don, what is that? He says, choose your clients more carefully. He says that in an interesting way. And in one way, he's right. If you could just eliminate, you know, your clients or have them fit within a nice little box. But as you know, if you're working in the real world, that's not possible. Economically, it's not possible. Emotionally, for most of us, it's not possible. Instead, we have to accept whoever knocks on our door. And barring that the client falls outside of our scope of practice, most of us are welcoming freely the client who comes in. And those clients, depending on the estimate, control about 87% of the variance in psychotherapy outcome. So that's the wild card. That's the wickedness in the environment. You don't know who's going to walk in. What does that mean? It means you have, that is a non-random, that is a random error, and you're going to have to respond to that in the moment. And so responsiveness is one of the first things you can do to improve your outcomes.
So, I want to interrupt here, Scott, because you bring up a very critical point that I hear time after time from therapists, and they say, so if the contributing factor to the therapeutic pie of outcomes is 87%, and that which is from the client, so it's got nothing to do with us,
Me,
with
yeah,
me.
yeah.
So can you say something about that?
Well, so let's look at some research, and I guess we should all warn that Daryl and I and Mark, we are enthusiastic about the research coming out about deliberate practice, and we're enthusiastic about the book. But right now, we are at the beginning of a journey, and
Absolutely.
I'm grateful, and I hope you don't feel bad when I say this, Daryl, that Daryl is younger than me. And that's a good thing, because I'm nearing the twilight of my career in terms of research, and we know there is so much more that waits discovery here, that has to come out, that has to be researched in detail. So let's circle back around to this issue of what it is we have to offer, and talk about the work of Jeb Brown. So Jeb publishes a study that we talk about at length in the book, where he shows that therapists who check their data more often, and I think this is, Daryl, I think this is precisely the point that Allison is making in her comment, that the more they check their data, the greater the likelihood that their outcomes will improve over time. This is this responsiveness element. If you're checking your data, in other words, if you're logging back in and looking at those graphs and seeing, is this client on track or not? What do their SRS scores look like? Did they fall short or not? Am I having a conversation? We
Yeah.
know that needles helping professionals. It bugs them. It gets under their skin, and it rightly should. If you're
Yeah.
checking your data multiple times per week, Daryl, or rather, Jeb has found, your outcomes can improve within 1 calendar year, a quarter of a standard deviation. It's like astonishing. If, on the other hand, all you do is put the data in the system and you check hardly at all, in other words, you're administering the measures, your outcomes, consistent with what Goldberg found, actually decline year after year by about 1/10 of a standard deviation.
Yeah. Yeah, for me, it reminds me of when I was younger, I used to play basketball, and I noticed one effect that's pretty clear is that we play very differently when we are keeping score. When there's when we go, okay, let's keep the points now, and then suddenly it's like game on, and you might be concerned about the performance in that situation less than the learning, but still there's a certain level of vigilance and consciousness that goes into the game, so to speak, that makes you want to pay attention to the details. But I think the flip side is that if you have practitioners who've been doing this for a while in a somewhat less conscious or more automatic way of doing it, when introduced this might first mess people up a little
Oh
bit.
yeah.
Yeah. And that's a given because now you're suddenly made aware of things that you worked on a more tacit, implicit level. This is going to stir things up. But that's where the challenge is. If you want to overcome the okay plateau, this is what it takes to get conscious again and then go into therapy, letting that go, because that's in the performance of delivery of therapeutic work. Then come out of that into getting more conscious of that, getting some other eyes on that as well.
Mm. So here again, and I can't remember, to be honest, Daryl, if we talked about this distinction or not, but you're highlighting two, I think, critical pieces as you begin to map out your blueprint of your performance, how you actually work. And then secondly, as you begin to administer the tools. And that's this difference between the performance zone and the learning zone. So
Yeah,
in case we didn't talk about that or flesh it out enough, can you just talk about that in relationship to these two elements we're introducing today, the distinction between those two pieces?
absolutely. I think this is something we briefly stated in the first Insiders webinar, but I think it's definitely worth highlighting because for me, this is the recurrent chorus that we have to intermingle with and weave in between because it's not either or. And let's kind of explain these two domains and see this as two overlapping Venn diagrams. Because on one hand, it's about performing where you want to deliver the best that you can at a given time. But on another hand, is this other domain that's slightly overlapping on, which is learning.
Mm,
Now, you can be focused on performance or performing and yet not learn. And you can be learning, and if you have your eyes on the scoreboard, so to speak, in the long run, that can translate to performance. However, an overemphasis of performance can impede deep learning, which is
mm,
what Elizabeth and Robert Bjork would talk about. That if your mindset is more about, look, I just need to do really well and I just need to perform. I mean, actually, don't even think about therapy. Think about formal education. We were made traditionally, most of us are, to score for the test. Just do well enough so that you score good enough results. What learning? It's more like a byproduct, and if that ever even happened, right? Like
mm,
most of the time, we don't even remember what we did that or what was that for anyway.
mm,
I think if we could see the relationship between performing and learning as if like a Mobius strip. So a Mobius strip is like if you cut a piece of paper and you join it together, but twist it.
mm,
So one piece of paper and then you twist it and then you join because you may start on performing, but if you go one round, it leads you to the learning dimension. Because on one hand it's performing, the other is learning.
mm.
But if you focus on learning, if you go round enough, it will lead to performance as well. Which is why the relationship of measurement, using some kind of routine outcome measures, whatever that is, to use it consistently, and then figuring out what your growth edge is. This interaction, this relationship on the Mobius strip is so critical because, like you pointed out, I think it's so easy to point to see what we call random errors, which is if I'm working with a client and we see some kind of things that I can improve, then we pour our heart and soul and work on that, right? But I think, Scott, your comment about the random and non-random error is also speaking about this other notion that we talked about in the book called leveraging,
Mm,
figuring out what are the low-hanging fruits to work on first.
mm.
Because you may be working on this one particular thing with this one particular client, which is a random error, which is just unique to that person. And all you need to do is recalibrate, adjust, use the feedback to feed forward into that and meet towards their needs in that way. I
So
think it's also important that we look at the more non-random stuff that has got high yield.
and I think it's critical. So if we just step back, because we've been covering a
Mm,
lot and at pretty fast pace. So what have we said so
yeah.
far? We've said today really is about establishing that baseline performance level. To do that, you can do two things. The first one is start to blueprint your therapy, your style. It's uniquely you. It is Peter Bruker's therapy. It is Allison's therapy. I do, you know, and when people ask me at workshops, what kind of therapy do you do? I literally say I do Scott Miller therapy, informed by everything from my birth to today. And some of that's influenced by training I've had in particular approaches. But those are sort of, in my position now, senior in the field, they are largely weak influences, and I think I come through, as I hope you do, in the work you do. So that's one way. The second way is to begin to measure your results. And once you measure, there are two sorts of errors that we're attending to. The first one is random errors, whatever the client brings in at that particular moment. You know, this is such a rich vein, we could go on about it for a long time. It's part of the reason why supervision has so much difficulty showing an impact on therapist performance over time. Why, you may
Oh
ask?
yeah.
Because much of what happens in supervision is attending to one-offs, but assuming they are recurring.
Oh
Most
yeah.
errors that are made in therapy are non-recurring random errors. And thinking you can learn something from randomness is called superstition. So you can't, and you shouldn't overgeneralize. So we've got, the first thing you have to do with random errors is identify them, and then you have to respond. Therapists work really hard at tailoring their work and responding to the individual. That is one side. The second side is these non-random errors, things that recur over time. We can begin to get a flavor of that by doing what you're recommending, which is gathering the outcome data, and then looking for factors that have leverage on outcome once we've identified those errors. What kinds of factors are we talking about here, Daryl?
Well, there's a broad range, but I think that, you know, we look at the common factors literature, there are things that we need to pay attention to, like tapping onto client factors, right? Things that they present, their resources, their agencies, their relationships, you know, and their cultural views and religious beliefs, even all in. And to be able to tap on those things are really fundamental. But then if you look at the literature, the key things that seem to be on the high end of the spectrum that has got high yield are stuff like focusing on goal consensus and agreement of the focus of where therapy should take. That has close to a zero 0.5 effect size, impact on the outcomes. And then naturally things like empathy, not just you understanding the person, but helping the person feel understood is so critical in that piece. And also, as we know, working alliance. But if we break down to working alliance, you can see overlaps about empathy, overlaps about goals as well. But here's the thing. These are broad strokes of what the literature tells you. I think what's important is to use your localized small data to see what are some of the things that they can tell you about your growth edge. Because where we want to take from the baseline is to move to the next step, which is to figure out the what before the how. And that one, when we start there, you want to think about what's leveraging, what's going to have high yield. You might even like to take the old adage about 80-20 rule, which is you want to work on 20% of the things to give you 80% of the results, as opposed to the other way around, where you're working so much on things that has moved the needle really barely. And considering your data and considering what the literature says to find out where you're at, it's going to be really critical.
Well, and Daryl, I just was going to pull up on the screen and share my screen here for a minute. Hang
Please
on.
do.
You're seeing, correct, the factors and effect size of variables that have leverage
I'm,
on outcome?
no, I'm just seeing a mirror of the Zoom, so I think it's your other screen.
Ah, how about that?
Yep.
These are things that Daryl mentioned that have leverage on outcome, and in particular thinking about the 80-20 effect. And we can talk about this in the particular for you, the learner, what you might have to learn. But then also, even if you don't have enough data gathered about the factors and where you might mention them, and there are where you might focus your attention rather. And let's just take a look at the top 3 or 4 here: empathy, goal consensus, and alliance. Um, you know, if you have no idea about what you should work on, I think you can probably invest in making sure you have goal consensus and collaboration with your clients, because its effect size is just simply off the charts. It's an amazing in terms of its impact. And my own work in doing deliberate practice consultations with individual clinicians is two things are typically overlooked in therapist efforts to improve. The first one is goal consensus, and this is especially true when the cases are falling short, when we're struggling. The therapist is working earnestly, but on something that's not of interest or engaging to the client. And then the second
Mm,
one is empathic responding. I don't know about you, Daryl, but I had two courses on empathy that included empathy, I should say. They weren't directly on empathy while I was in graduate school. And then after that, that was just assumed, and the rest of my education was about stats, research, and then particular therapy models. So here are the particulars. I guess I want to go back though, Daryl, and ask you to clarify a little bit more about what you mean when you say looking at your own data, because you were,
mhm.
what is it that they're looking at and looking for to find the what to work on?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. I think, this is a tall order to be doing all by hand. I mean, you can do this by collating your results on a spreadsheet and tabulating them, but there are other systems out there that can help you do that. Things like My Outcomes, Fit Outcomes, and the couple of that you talk about in your blogs, Scott. And people, if you're interested, you should see and just look up on scottdmillis.com website to find out that. But I think from the data, which is natively and individually yours, you want to pay attention to what is glaring, anything that stands out. When you look at your data, you just want to take a broad stroke and see if there are any kind of numbers that sort of doesn't fit with benchmarks. And in the book, we do provide some benchmarks as a reference, not so much as to make you perform better or to make you feel bad or good. That's not the point. The point is reference, is to give you a reference of where you stand. So for example, if I say that my effect size or my raw effect size is point 0.8, what does that mean, right? In reference to an aggregated level. So having that sort of reference is really useful. But the next step, if there's nothing glaring that stands out, is to start to splice your data according to, maybe you work with people who have OCD, for example, or you work with people who hear voices. You want to pass out in that way to see, are there any kind of differences in those results. But I think one very good way to splice your data is to splice between those that have good outcomes and those who have poor outcomes or unsuccessful cases. Because by making that split, you are now doing a different kind of inverse logic. You are trying to say, okay, is there any difference with this? Are there any patterns, non-random patterns with people who don't use successful cases? Not so much as just in therapy, but with me. Because this is contextually about, in this space, in this context, as me as a therapist. And once you look at that, you want to see, are there any glaring patterns with that?
Mm.
Now, that's it. That's still quite daunting. There's still quite a lot of work to be done. And that's why, we have also created the taxonomy of deliberate practice activities worksheet, where we deconstruct everything in a therapy hour to help people examine where they're at. So things like how they start a session, how they end the session, how they deepen the process, how they deal with ruptures, and so on. It's a full list of stuff. And you find that in the book, in the appendix that we talk about as well. And interestingly, Scott, and you and me, we've been getting response from people who are always asking about this, and they say, can you share this with me? It's pretty interesting. And some people really like the idea because it helps them see it. Some people feel it as pretty overwhelming to kind of look at this in such micro detail. But the point is to overcome automaticity.
Yeah, yeah, and if you watch an expert guitar teacher work, they're frequently focusing on just how you hold your finger above the string for that moment before you hit, or how you make a transition from one chord to the next. Or they might spend weeks and weeks working on how you pluck the strings in a particular for a particular note, getting the timing right. And I think it can be overwhelming because it is precisely disruptive to automaticity when
That's right.
at least you were proficient at it. And now you are crap again because you're focused on your finger movement. It's sometimes the temptation is to just say, well, to hell with it. I'm just going to play it this way. And in many ways, while you're deliberately practicing, your proficient behavior will seem far superior to the behavior you're practicing. And that is ego defeating, I have to say. Having tried to apply this in both the guitar,
Yeah.
to close-up sleight of hand, so it can be very defeating. And again, the key for me is often I'm then comparing my current deliberate practice efforts, which have completely disrupted my automaticity, to my view of my proficient behavior, which was
Mm.
good in terms of it being average, but it's not likely to improve me, to result in improvements if I just continue.
So then the role of this teacher or coach in this case, who's going to help you to articulate and to pinpoint what to work on, is going to be quite central, isn't it? Because if he simply just tells you to work on something that you don't see irrational, or he's more focused about him looking good in front of you, that's not going to really help, isn't it?
Well, and Daryl, let me bring up one other thing and see what
Please.
advice you have to offer. My experience with doing the consultations is that they frequently end with the comment from my consultee of, "Is that it? You're not going to give me any more things to do? We're just going to do this little thing?" And when I say yes, there's kind of a disappointment. So in a way, books are problematic, like even our book, Better Results, because you can read them because they're all within these two pieces of cardboard or paper. So you can read them from start to finish, and then supposedly that should be it. But
That's
in
right.
many ways, when I say, well, gather 60 cases of evidence and then talk to me in 6 months. What? Can't we just do, can't we do something more? Can't you give me one more thing to work on? And when I say no, it's kind of like, psst, it's sort of deflating. What do you say to this?
I don't know what to say to that. I mean, that it's true because people they are so used to. It's like, if you have a family of kids who's always been eating potato chips and McDonald's, and then suddenly you give them Jamie Oliver's green vegetables, they go like, yeah, like
Yeah.
what? Give me the real stuff. Or they're gonna want something more. And I think here there's a lot of undoing of sorts, isn't it? That we need to kind of come back full circle again, and to be able to look at the stuff. I got partially distracted from what you were saying because Osama had also asked a really good question about
Mm.
what were you talking about in this, and he asked whether do we envision the role of a coach to be different from a clinical supervisor, or should it be adopted by someone else? And this is exactly what we talk about in our DP workshop, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So the answer is, because I think, Osama, you correctly point out, and this is connected to what we were just talking about, because I think what I'm offering when I'm doing DP consultations is very different from supervision.
Yeah.
And not to denigrate supervision, it is what it is. Most of it being therapy for the therapist. And again, I don't mean that in a negative way. We need support for our work, but Olympic athletes don't have supervisors that are trying to teach them the exact right way to do it, or providing emotional solace. Maybe they have friends that do that. Maybe their coach does some of that. What they have are very specific coaches targeted at various aspects related to their performance. They might have a strength coach, they might have an endurance coach, they might have an equipment coach, they might have a costuming coach. And all of these people have a very specific area of expertise. And so that means that once you've done everything we've talked about so far, and you're targeting a specific area via the TDPA, and if you don't have a copy of the TDPA, the taxonomy, then either email Daryl or I, or just simply download the measures again from my website, because the TDPA is in there. If you don't want to write up or mess up the copy that's in the book, or make a copy of it, and once you've narrowed it down to that piece, then you're going to have to find somebody who's an expert in that area, and get some advice. And I would say, and Daryl, feel free to agree or disagree with this, reach for the top. Reach for somebody who you think might be out of your reach. What do you have to lose? So let me give you an example of this. As an undergraduate student, I was writing a paper in a cognitive psychology class, not cognitive therapy, but the psychology of cognition. And I was supposed to take up a contrary position. So I chose radical behaviorism as a contrary position. And as I was writing the paper, I got all stuck and confused about the different arguments. And so I simply picked up the phone and called B.F. Skinner. True story. Not only did he answer the phone, but after a brief conversation, he told me, this was many years ago, he told me to mail the copy of my paper to him, and he would correct it, which he did, and sent it back in an envelope that I still have to this day with the articles that he had written to clarify the topic. So find that specific thing and then reach out to that coach. And hey, coaches have a shelf life. So you don't have to see the same coach for the rest of your life. You've got to see that coach until they help you master the element that you need. And the key to that is someone who can develop exercises that you can work on your own to flex that muscle that needs to be flexed.
Absolutely. And, I think more and more clinical supervisors of sort can sense this unrest. Like there's no clear a pathway for them to work, which is why, in the online course that we did for reuniting clinical supervision, more and more people are coming to this notion that just helping them with stuck cases alone, or helping the therapist, though it's important, it's not that we are saying it's not important, but it's just not going to be able to translate that into the work, because we are already 2 steps removed from the therapy room. What more if we don't have systems in place to guide us? Alison chimed in, Scott, and she talked about her work with you, and she says it really does not feel like the typical supervision, which
I'm not sure if that's a compliment or what. Yeah, it is not like supervision, and I think that the directness of it can be sort of shocking. Initially, because we're saying there's the point that you can improve upon, here's the exercise, and go do it. It's now up to you. Your coach can't follow you through the pole vault. All they can do is comment on your technique.
Yeah, and with this is can be contentious ground, because we value clinical supervision.
Absolutely.
We all do. But the thing is, I remember when I first talked about this on psychotherapy.net, and I had people writing to me, and they were upset with what I was saying, and you could tell how much we hold dear to this. But I guess what we're really saying is that we need to reimagine this and keep our eyes on the ball, because what is the main thing that we're trying to do here? What's it for? We just need to ask the fundamental question, what's it for? If we can't answer that, what's it for? Who's it for? If we can't figure that out, we will just go in the pathways that we already know.
And so I think, Daryl, can I just interrupt, because I know that Peter has also said something here, that he says that what are your ideas about how we can use peer supervision for DP? And I know that we've only got a couple of minutes left here, so I think we ought to make a comment about this.
Please do. It's an important question.
My comment is that, how do I say this nicely? If we're talking about DP, Olympic athletes tend to hang out with other Olympic athletes. And so that means that you have to be, and why do they do that? Not necessarily because they're going to learn from those people, but because DP is hard work and they need to be around people who are committed to the same objective. And it rubs off on you. Their enthusiasm rubs off on you. Their willingness to push themselves and be in the learning zone rather than the performing zone, that stuff rubs off on you. So in that respect, I think peers can be important. Whether or
Mhm.
not they can actually guide you in the direct way, uh, maybe. Thoughts, Daryl?
Yeah, I hold similar views about this. I think I think if we can understand, if we can answer the question of if we have a peer consult, a peer group that comes together, we have to be very clear what's it for as well. Because, like you said, if it's to figure out and to push you towards and through your growth edge, that's probably not going to serve that function that much. But I've heard people in Scandinavian countries now talking about wanting to form more and more of this kind of groups, and very clearly they are trying to support each other to
Hmm.
kind of nudge each other the way you talk about it, right? Or what Brian Eno would call forming a seniors community. Forming a group of people who with the same passion, that can spark off and motivate each other. And if that's what it's for, I think having the kind of framework that we talk about in the book, from the baselines to the reference of the taxonomy, and then to something that we will talk about in our third and final installment of this Insiders Group, is how to develop this system that's sustainable. I think that can be possible.
Hmm. And that's where we're going the next time that we meet, because all of this information is great, but if you don't have a sustainable system of deliberate practice, then it's going to be too hard to sustain. And I'm thinking of the one quote in the book about that losers have goals
Oh yeah.
and winners have a system. And that's where we're going the next time we meet.
Sounds good, Scott. So we would send all you guys, thank you so much again for supporting this work, because we're really in the early days, as Scott has said, and we would email you the dates that's coming up for the third and final installment, where we would take a deep dive and look at how to develop a sustainable system of deliberate practice.
And I know we have a third hamper of gifts and goodies that is
Yes.
coming out. Is that correct, Daryl?
That's right. So that's also going to be a little surprise of what you might get from that. We are still working at the companion workbook towards this, and once we've got that out, we would ship it to you into your inbox.
Cool. Great to see you, Daryl.
Good to see you too, Scott. Keep well.
And thanks to everybody for joining us.